Archaeodeath, Death and Memory, Past and Present, with Professor Howard Williams.
Archaeodeathlings, it's Archaeology Professor Howard Williams here, and I'm delighted to have today with me a special feline friend. No, sorry, it's Meghan with a feline, and wonderful to chat with you, Meghan. Please introduce yourself to our viewers and listeners.
Hi, I am, oh my goodness, now I am Dr. Meghan Mattsson McGinnis as of 3 weeks ago. Oh, that was Virgil. He's also an expert on Old Norse religion. And I am, I suppose you would say, now I am an early career researcher in archaeology, having just done my doctorate at Stockholm University when Howard was my opponent, which was a really fun and exciting experience.
It was indeed, and it was lovely to meet you and to be part of the serious but also celebratory mixture that is a public examination in the Swedish system. And,
yes.
And it was a privilege to read this, the thesis. Dun, dun, dun. And we hopefully that's what we're going to be talking about. But I would love to learn a little bit, and I do this for all my guests because I think it's important for students and the public to know how one becomes the people, the experts that we are in our topics. I'd wonder if you'd be willing to give an introduction to who you are and where you came from. How did you get into archaeology, Meghan?
Well, I am from Kentucky in the USA originally, though I have been living now in Sweden in the Mälarön Valley in Eskilstuna near Stockholm for, oh my goodness, on Friday it will be 13 years now. But when I was growing up in the US, I can't really remember a time that I wasn't interested in historical things, archaeology, kind of art things. My mother is a teacher, and my dad is also just really interested in history, and we grew up in this by American standards, old part of the town. And so as far back as I can remember, they were always kind of getting me excited about just all this history that was around us. And I just thought that was absolutely fascinating. And so my mom will say that, from I think from the time I sort of learned what an archaeologist was, or wasn't even quite sure what it was, I was like, oh, I want to do that. That'll be fun. And as I got a bit older, I think I kind of thought that maybe that wasn't really something you could really do. Or I sort of got interested in other things as well. And I've also, as I said, always been interested in like art and such too. So I ended up going to starting college in the US in art school. And in art school, I also decided to do art history as a sort of side project, because I was like, you have to have something you might actually be able to supplement being an artist with, since that's not a very stable job. Not that being an art historian is necessarily so much better, but still you can teach and stuff. And as I got into art history some more, I was interested in ancient and medieval art history. And I kind of got back I wouldn't say reawakened, because I don't think it had ever really gone away, but I started more actively studying archaeology again, and kind of did that along several of my professors in art history were also archaeologists. So I had this kind of, it's one of those things where do you even kind of make the line between these two disciplines a lot of the time?
Yes, exactly, yeah.
So I was doing kind of archaeology and art history. And after I met my now husband and moved to Sweden, I knew by that point I had decided I actually wanted to, instead of being an artist professionally and academic kind of as an adjunct thing, to sort of do it the other way around. So I was trying to decide what I wanted to do here, and I started taking some courses at Stockholm University, and I really just kind of fell in love with the archaeology of the Nordic countries, and the fact that it really is so present in the landscape here. And that, I could go over to my mother-in-law's house and there were just rune stones, 5 minutes walk from there. Or, in this area, whenever you're sort of driving through the countryside, you see all these mounds and everything. And I think for me, starting to study the archaeology also became a way to kind of get to know the new place I was living in. And then I decided, you know what, this is what I want to do. This is what I do want to focus on.
Fantastic.
And so I did my master's in archaeology at Stockholm. And then in 2020, I started a employment as a doctorand, a doctoral student in the Department of Archaeology. And that's when I wrote my thesis that you eventually were the opponent for. So that's where I come from. So in some ways, becoming an archaeologist was kind of coming home to what I always, I think, wanted to do, and finally deciding to actually do it.
What a wonderful story, because there's so many routes into the world of archaeology. It was somehow always going to happen for you, but also it could so easily have not have happened. There's so many people who have a passion for archaeology from an early age, who take that interest into other fields, into other lines of work, and they never lose it, but they never come back to it. But it's wonderful. It's a wonderful story. So let's discuss these amulet rings then. There's obviously, I've already grilled you as an opponent, so I don't want to sort of rehearse everything. But I mean, for our audience who may have only heard of these, or not even come across these, or may have come across a subset of them called the Thor hammer rings, that are different from Thor's, pendants, but Thor gets into everything. But could you give us an outline of what are these things?
Yes, and I think here for a moment I'm going to actually try to put up a slide showing some of the amulet rings, because I think you can't really, for me, I feel like once you see them, they're fascinating. But of course,
yes,
I might be a bit biased in that.
You should be biased.
Opinion.
I'm biased. Everyone, they are amazing, weird, intriguing.
Complex. For me, I mean, obviously for me, once you see them, you kind of get a little obsessed with them. What's their deal? Which is, of course, what we're going to talk about here. All right, so here we have a small selection of amulet rings from a handful of sites around what is now the mainland of Sweden.
Yes.
And one of the islands that are now a part of Sweden. And on this slide here, of course, you can already see that the category, or the type that I'm and Swedish archaeologists in general are calling amulet rings, is very broad, and it includes oh goodness, how do I define amulet rings in my thesis? Something to the effect of that it's a metallic object that the main body of the object is a ring shape, as the name suggests. And this ring is threaded with various small pendants that are usually identified as some kind of amulets because a lot of them tend to be the same shapes that we encounter in single pendants in other contexts.
Right.
This type can get a little bit tricky in that there are also, I would argue, and several other scholars have also argued, rings without any pendants that also function in the same way. But of course, those are sometimes a lot harder to identify because if you just find an iron ring
Just find
on
a
its
ring, yeah.
own, it's hard to know what that's for. But when we have identified them, it's been places such as Lille-Olivier, which we can see some of the rings from that one up in the top left corner, where you had deposits with rings with other pendants on them and also rings without pendants. So it became a bit or a lot easier to see that these things are being used in similar ways.
Right.
So amulet rings start appearing in the archaeological record in context that the earliest ones that we've found them associated with are the mid 500s CE AD, and they keep appearing in various ways, really until the end of the pre-Christian religions in Sweden being kind of actively practiced. So there are some that we think are still in use into the, say, 1100s. So there's something that are intensely used throughout the Vendel, or what on the continent is called Merovingian period, and throughout the whole of the Viking Age.
Right.
And they're not used everywhere in what we like to call the Viking world. However, they're really highly concentrated, where you find these big deposits of them, or you find them a lot, is in the eastern central part of what is now Sweden. And then sort of anywhere that the people from the eastern and central part of Sweden traveled during the Viking Age. So the islands of Åland, into what is now Finland and Ukraine and Russia, where you can follow these sort of burials along what we refer to a lot of times as the eastern routes of Viking travel. You also find amulet rings. But you also find amulet rings outside of this main sort of East Swedish corridor in smaller numbers. They will sometimes show up in Norway and Denmark. I can't think of any amulet rings that have actually showed up in England that I know of so far, but you will get sort of little pockets of them other places.
Okay, so they're an Eastern Viking or pre-Viking, because the terminology confuses everyone, doesn't it? But they're a Baltic region, Eastern Viking or pre-Viking into Viking era, what we'd call late Iron Age, or in Britain we'd call early Middle Ages. So they're not purely, they're not everywhere in the Viking Age, and they're not just the Viking Age. They're broader, but they don't continue into the Christian period. They end at that period of conversion in the Viking Age. Is that so? We assume. I mean, is this is a question for you to wince at? Would you call them pagan, heathen? Would you see them as non-Christian, pre-Christian?
I would see them as, I think they are pagan. You can say that, not in the sense that I think the people using them necessarily, I don't think it's, how do I put this? I don't think it's impossible that once you get into the period of conversion, which is quite long in Sweden, that there couldn't be people that in a lot of ways experienced or identified themselves as Christian, who may still have sometimes used amulet rings in various capacities because of there being at that point, a traditional practice and something that is connected to ways of relating in the world, which I think we'll get into talking about.
Yes, yeah.
Which don't necessarily neatly stop with Christianity, or don't stop with Christianity at all, really. Though the ways that people think about the different elements that you're relating with change. The fact you have to relate with all these things in the world doesn't change, I would argue.
Yes,
And
I mean,
so
sorry, go on.
they're I think they are, I think there's something that is pagan in the sense that there's something that comes out of the period when Scandinavia is, mostly pagan, and there's something that is pagan in the sense of that they're used in very closely connected with religious rituals that are pre-Christian, but they are something that we still see used as people start to Christianize. It's only until really, how do I put it, Christianity is more institutionalized that you see them tapering off. But there's definitely cemeteries that they appear in where we have people that, and of course the question of, well, you talked to Frida as well during her defense about what is pagan and what is Christian gets really complicated from a burial perspective. But I think it's safe to say that there's something that was still very much a part of the world during the conversion period. And though amulet rings themselves eventually stopped being used in the ways that they were in the pre-Christian period, once Christianity is more institutionalized, I guess we would say, in East Scandinavia, there are actually practices that continue to use metal ring-shaped objects in ways that are still related to how amulet rings were used. Mariana Henriksen has talked a lot about these, that you find, for example, the ring-shaped handles of church doors being used in ritualized actions that you can really convincingly, and she very convincingly does, draw a straight line from how people were using amulet rings in more pagan contexts to how these other rings keep being used when people are overwhelmingly Christian even.
So when people, just so that those are not familiar, why we're so cautious about these terminologies and categorizations is that people's definitions of what is pagan only becomes a thing when the church decides it's something that's not Christian. So it's about trying to understand from a sort of internal perspective that many of the things that we're labeling as a part of a religious system that wasn't a system. It was just part of the daily life, part of the seasons, part of the annual rituals, part of your relationship with supernatural that we could package and call pagan, or but it's not quite. We've got to be always aware when we're talking about these objects that no one was going, my pagan ring for my pagan gods, where I'm being pagan today. Oh, well, lovely, dear. You go and do that in the pagan temple, and I'll just sit here and do some cooking, or maybe I'll go hunting with some of the other non-pagan activities, as if there's some kind of strict divide between so I hope that's a fair characterization. Correct me if I've misguided people.
No, I think that's very true. And I think what's also interesting is, of course, once you do have people converting, that they're, and I think you could say even before, because of course the Vikings, the people who live in Viking Age Scandinavia, late Iron Age Scandinavia, are aware of Christianity, and they do interact with this. And so I think that I don't think there's no sense that like we have a different way of thinking about what would you call it, sort of the unseen parts of the world, or than these other people that live in, say, Byzantium and things like that. So I think there are I think there is some awarenesses of, well, I mean, just in the same way that there are awarenesses of these people aren't necessarily the same as the way they don't do things. They don't do things the way we do things.
Yeah.
And of course, once Christianity becomes more of a force in Scandinavia, then you do, you can read about, of course, the sagas are obviously later, and there's a lot of problems with those, but the ideas of things register as very things you shouldn't do if you're a Christian.
Yes.
And that is certainly a thing. But I think what becomes so interesting is that certain things that we might, trying to make a sharp binary, be like, well, you wouldn't do this if you were Christian, or wouldn't you think that was sort of pagan and something you shouldn't do, might not necessarily be the case, or a lot of times doesn't seem to be the case. I think we have to remember that this is all being negotiated, and what we think of as something that would be appropriate for a person identifying as one part of the group or other might not be actually how people experience this, and often wasn't. And also the fact that that just that it isn't a binary. A lot
Exactly.
of things that we think, oh, you do this and then you wouldn't do that because now you're Christian. We know people are still doing, and also that for a lot of people, certain things would probably have, they talk about, say, the sacrificing horses, that was something, that is something that, once you're a Christian, you shouldn't do. You shouldn't do this. But other things would have just been part of the world, or that maybe they are pagan, but you still do them because they're important.
Let's be crystal clear for those that often get seduced into or confused about this in an early historic period where we do have fragmentary written sources. Those sources are important, but they're incredibly problematic. No one's writing down, no one's describing these as amulet rings. These are our descriptions for a complex set of object types that are not appearing in the written sources. Is that a fair, stark reality, that we can only use archaeology to access these?
Well, there are some written sources that refer to objects that we think are probably amulet rings.
Oh.
So there are a couple of the edict poems. Oh, now I'm going to get in trouble forgetting which it is. But there are some written sources that refer to the use of what are called oath rings. And that these seem to be a very important part of, again, if we believe the medieval chroniclers. And this is something that does, it's kind of one of those things where, they sort of refer to them as if this is something everybody knows about, because presumably everyone does know about them, which is always very frustrating for us later.
It's like these historical novels that go, he then entered into the room and leaned against the 3'4" tall cabinet, which had embossed this and a decoration. Why would you say that? These obviously control. I had a colleague who wrote this historical novel about a Roman city, and it was just the detail was ridiculous. Like, he then had this type of food, and he felt very sick because it clearly was undercooked because they used this particular type of loaf. And it's just like, no one says that. And likewise, the sources coming down to us aren't going to give all these details about exactly how people dressed, how they thought about the material world around them. So sorry, I just find it really funny how
it is really
we want
funny.
we want that knowledge.
Well, yes, it would be lovely.
Yeah.
And that's why everyone uses Ibn Fadlan to talk about Viking Age funerals, because of course he's not from that culture, and he is or talking to people from this culture being like, this is really different and strange, so I want to hear all these details. But what is interesting is when the oath rings do come up, they come up because what's being done with them is something significant. And so it's not so much that, well, they are sometimes described very slightly, that there is a ring and it stands in a on some kind of altar or somewhere in an important kind of place where you're doing rituals.
Right.
And then they go and they perform these oath swearing ceremonies with it. But they show up in the sources because the characters in the story are, say, making this contract with each other.
Right.
So it's what's being done around these objects that is why they're important to mention.
So let's focus down on the archaeology. Where do we find these, and how do we think they were being used?
Oh my goodness, Howard. We find them all over the place here in eastern Sweden. It's great. As soon as right now, whenever they do a new dig, somebody finds some amulet rings, which I love. We find them, of course, in burials, which is, I think, where people are most familiar with them. Also, that are working outside of Scandinavia have probably heard, as you said, about Thor's hammer type amulet rings, which you yourself have written about. And so we find them in cremation burials. We find them in occasionally in inhumation burials, which also brings up some of these interesting questions of, could some of these people in these inhumations have experienced themselves as Christian, but still are being buried with these quite pagan,
yes,
and pagan, traditionally pagan, we can say, objects. And we find them at what we in Scandinavian archaeology refer to rather vaguely as cult places, which is a nice catch-all term for any site where it seems that one of the main functions of the site is to do ritualized actions, and these are usually some kind of natural or constructed outdoor space, or a combination of where you were repeatedly carrying out ritual actions. And sometimes these can also be in buildings as well. So it's a very floating category.
So people have suggested that there are some structures at major central places that could be shrines or temples, to use that category. But we do have this broader range, and there's debate about the identification, but these broader range of open air, distinctive outcrop sites. So there's, we don't have a clear categories because the evidence isn't that precise. Is that?
Well, the category is so broad because people from this communities. From this period in this region are using lots of different types of sites as places to do rituals. And we can see, of course, patterns in there's certain kinds of places in the landscape that people are clearly experiencing as somewhere that you would need or want to do rituals. But those places can be anything from rocky outcroppings to glacial erratic boulders that are sort of these large boulders just standing in the middle of fields, which are crazy looking. I can totally understand why people would be drawn to these, or wetland sites. And then you also, of course, get into the issue of what's a cult place and what's a settlement, or you have settlements with cult places in them, or you have burial places which are in themselves also cult places because you're doing rituals there. And then sometimes within the burial places, you also have smaller areas that are marked off that seem to be like miniature versions of these larger cult places. So
it's messy. It
is messy. And then we also find them in settlement sites. Again, that gets into the issue of, as I said, that some of the places you find them in settlement sites seem to be cult places within the settlement. But sometimes we find them in association with buildings or parts of, for example, in the early urban settlement of Berka, there's some that have been put sort of under a walkway in the town. We sometimes find them in wells. We sometimes find them in places where people were doing handiwork of different kinds. So they really kind of show up everywhere, somewhere, of course. But the places that they most often show up are in areas, grave fields, areas where people are being buried, or the dead are being interacted with in some way. And cult places.
Living and places of worship or interaction with spirits, the supernatural, the dead, the ancestors, the deities, whatever we do, you know, there's that sort of vagueness, but they're about interaction with other worlds in a way, or with
Yes.
times of gathering and community transition, whether it's religious or social. How do we think they're actually being used? Are they being worn, wafted around on sticks, suspended? What are these? What are they doing with these amulet rings?
Right. What are they doing with these amulet rings? That is something I've thought a lot about. Yes.
I know.
Right. Yeah, you do know. So the way that it's so funny because, as you said, when you start talking about them, and you're like, oh, they're used here and they're used here and they're used everywhere. Sometimes I'll hear myself talking about this and I'm like, oh my goodness, it sounds like I'm just kind of throwing out everything as if they're connected to everything. But yeah. I think that's part of why they're important, is that they are connected to all kinds of things and places and, as you said, moments in time that people in these communities felt were really important. And that's the short answer for what they do, is that from my studies of them, when I really first started to feel like now I'm having some kind of, I don't know, breakthrough about thinking about them, was when I started thinking about relationality and the idea of how people in the late Iron Age could experience the range of ways that you can interact with the world, and that your community isn't necessarily, or isn't just you living people, but also dead people and the gods, and not just the gods, but also other beings that live in the landscape, or that the landscape itself in various ways can be something that you have to relate to, that you need to interact with and make kind of contracts with. And so amulet rings are a way of managing relationships in late
that's
Iron
a really good
Age
way of putting it.
Mallow-Darlan. And this means, of course, and if you think about all the ways that people manage relationships in the world today, at any time that humans are doing communities, being in communities, that can mean all kinds of things. That can mean that you're, as in the when we do think we're seeing them in the written sources, that this is something where you're swearing a contract with another living person.
Yes.
And so changing the way that you relate with them in the community. And of course, we talk a lot in early medieval and late Iron Age archaeology about, these societies, this isn't like a national top-down thing. It's all about, personally, your personal relationship to, the chief that you're working, you go and fight for, or the person, the family that you've now married, someone from their family, and now your families have relationships to one another, and these sort of small scale societies that's what the society is. It's all these relationships between each other. And so we talk about that, and I think sometimes we talk about that and we don't always then apply that to when we're actually looking at the archaeology, or what does that, I tried to do a lot in my thesis of, okay, if I accept that I think this is how people are experiencing the world, if I take that seriously, what does that mean for what I'm looking at now? Because it can be easy to sort of compartmentalize different parts of what we're looking at, I think.
Yes.
And so, sorry, I get so excited and off on tangents.
It's really cool stuff. Keep going.
But so if you think about all the different relationships, that can mean you're making a relationship with someone. You're saying, oh, now we're, say, if we want to give a very archetypical, what we imagine is happening in the or something we know was happening in the Viking Age communities, is that, okay, I am now swearing to, fight with you in this way. That's one thing you're doing, but managing relationships can also mean, of course, changing the relationship. It can mean that that maybe now we're not in relationship with one another in some way, or we want to break an oath with each other, or just that something in the community has changed and now we have to deal with the way that it has changed, or we want to make a change in what is happening in the world. And I think amulet rings both respond to changes in the world. Most especially we can see, and I know this is very much preaching to the choir for you, Howard Williams, is when people die. Yeah. And what that does, that the dead person is now going through a change in how they're being in the world, of course, and the people around them are, how they now relate to this person who's now dead is changing. And of course, the community is also changing, right? Because now, say, for example, someone's inheriting their belongings, or there's someone missing now in the community. So it can be a response to, I think the example of seeing them in funerary context is in some ways one of the most, as with a lot of mortuary archaeology, the most poignant, because we can very easily understand that, okay, this person has now died, and the amulet rings that are being used in graves are doing something for the dead person. I believe they're helping, and you've written about that too, helping transition them into their new phase of being. But they're also doing something, they can also do things for the living people, right, that the living are now affected in a different way, and need to interact with this person in a different way.
So these cult sites have evidence of sacrificing animals, other kinds of open, but they're also depositing these rings, aren't they? Or are they burying them, or displaying them, and breaking them?
I totally forgot your question about how are people actually using them.
Yeah. I'm just wondering, because are they like fixed on an object that everyone goes and touches, or are they like, bringing them as gifts to the site for occasions? I know that's the kind of thing. It's difficult to know, I know, but
this is another one of these questions where partly we can't know for sure, but that's never stopped me writing about anything.
It's archaeology.
Exactly. But the answer, I think, would be all of the above from what we do see, and the sort of the wide array of where they appear. At Lille-Levi, which is a cult place site in Uppland in Sweden, which is one of the sites that I think was probably one of the biggest breakthroughs about thinking about amulet rings, and especially about thinking about amulet rings that weren't in burials. And at Lille-Levi, you get this really, so it's I suppose I should just describe the site. It's, people have made these terraces in the landscape around these. In Sweden, there's all these sort of glacial ridges that run all over the country. And Lille-Levi, if I'm remembering correctly, they've taken one of these glacial terraces and smoothed it out into a flat plateau kind of area.
Absolutely.
And they've built stone structures on this, kind of stone pavements on this area.
It's like platforms for rituals. Is that the idea?
And also they've enclosed the area with a series of, and not enclosed in a sense that they've literally built a wall around it, but they've marked out a boundary.
So it's like a sacred space with a stage, like a theatre or something like that. But this is not for an entertaining juggling act or something. This is something a bit more profound. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's also evidences of some kind of structure near the series of pavements that there's a lot of debate of what that structure is. And some archaeologists, Olaf Sundquist, History of Religions, professor has, I think, quite convincingly argued that it could be a platform where someone gets on the platform to perform a divinatory, like seder, as they say, which is something that we do actually see referred to in the sources. Neil Price, of course, famously has written a lot about this. And so this may be evidence of that, or it may be some other kind of freestanding structure. But what's interesting is that it doesn't seem to be, it's not a building.
No.
But it's a some kind of structure, that wooden structure that's being used in ritual. And then the perimeter of the site, the sacred area, is being marked out by a series of posts. And on the posts, they have stapled amulet rings. And this is something that appears at other sites too, that we now have seen. That this is kind of one of the things that once we started thinking about these post perimeters, that now people are more sort of aware that that's a thing. And when they were doing new excavations at Gamla Uppsala, the most famous gold site in all of sort of late Iron Age Scandinavia in Sweden, they found this giant, huge post row recently. I say recently, but within the last 10 years. Yeah. So at Levi, you can see that they have put amulet rings up around the perimeter of the site. They've stapled them to these poles, which we see other places that they seem to be hanging on poles. But they've also deposited them on top of and inside and between the stones of these stone pavements, and in other ways. And in the sites I was talking about in my thesis, I talk about one grave field, one cult place, and one settlement that has cult places within it and gets turned into a cult place. I noticed that you're using amulet rings on sort of the peripheries of things, where you're making boundaries with them.
Right.
And this seems to be, you can do that either by hanging them up on something, but it seems to be that you can also perhaps sometimes do that just by putting them on the ground.
Right.
And you're also seeing them in very central areas of these cult places around these structures that are being used for other kinds of offerings and other practices where you're relating to the supernatural, giving to them in various ways. So people are hanging them up, people are depositing them. There's been some discussion about perhaps sometimes they're hanging them in trees as well. Could be something that's happening because we hear in the written sources, and then we have found archaeologically that this does seem to be something that actually happened at some cult places, that you have these sort of sacred trees or groves that are part of the landscape. And it could be that sometimes we're finding amulet rings. We find amulet rings sometimes on what would have been the ground in areas where there seems to be these sacred groves. So it could be that they were hanging up on the trees and then falling down. And then in burials, most famously, or burials, yes. It's so hard when you're thinking about all these terms and you're like, burials, of course. What do we mean by burials? That's a different video, Howard.
So many different deposits, cremation, inhumation, different, But
they're putting them on top of the cremated remains in the urn. Or they're putting them in the edges of graves, or they're putting them inside mounds. So again, they seem to be this quite maybe not all-purpose object, but something that you can use. To me, how I tried to reconcile this or think about this sort of diversity of how you can use them and find them is that you can use them, or you want to use them anywhere that there's somewhere that's kind of powerful, but also dangerous, potentially.
So they have These objects vary a lot. Most of them are iron, but others are made of other materials. They either rings on rings, or they have miniature hammers on rings, but sometimes they have other tools too.
Yes.
So what's that about? Is that referencing particular deities? Is it representing particular technologies? What do you think those miniature objects are doing on these rings?
I think, again, all of the above. I think that they are, when they're making amulet rings, I think they're wanting to bring together and concentrate a variety of symbols and materials and artifacts that are powerful and important in their world into one portable object.
So they're sort of like concentrating concepts and other kinds of practices into these rings, and that makes them powerful.
So. In my thesis, I refer to it as, they're assembling, affects that are, and of course, affect is a fancy way of talking about kind of anything that how something that makes you have a kind of embodied response in the world. So it can be an emotion, but it can also be a sensation. And it's a way to talk about all those things together. And so for me, the amulet rings are bringing together these references to other objects. Also, the material itself, iron, appears to be a very powerful, kind of magically loaded substance in the late Iron Age and beyond. And that's something a lot of people have discussed. And so there's that. And then you are bringing in these symbols, these forms that reference, say, you bring in, there's ones that have small pendants that seem to be scythes or sickles. And sickles and scythes, of course, reference, agriculture. And that's an extremely important part of the world that you're living in. And it's also something that's transformative, the cycle of and using the iron to cut things. And then we find graves with women being buried with sickles, who seem to be perhaps having some kind of probably doing some kind of special role in the agriculture, that the agriculture itself is being ritualized. And of course, that's something we know does happen in historically documented times and places. I mean, up until the 1900s even. So so that's something that this is being referred to, the fact that it's iron, and that iron is also something you make weapons out of, and iron is something you make tools out of, and iron is transformed in the fire. That's being brought in. And fire is also something that gets used in rituals. And or cutting, the letting of blood, also happens in rituals. And then you have things that they'll make miniatures on amulet rings that are miniatures of cutting tools, and they won't actually put an edge on them, but they'll hammer it out as if you were going to put an edge on it. So they're making those associations. And then, of course, the tools that also we are, pretty sure, for a lot of good reasons, would, in a person living in that community, make them think of, a certain god. For example, Thor. That's why they always get talked about Thor's hammer rings, because Thor's hammer is very noticeable. And I know we talked about this during my defense. So I don't think Thor is sort of the only person, the only being that's being drawn on in these. But I think he is, of course, he can be used as a good example of how the amulet rings are, also, I think one of the things I've tried to do is emphasize not just symbolizing, but actually actively making a relation with.
So people
God.
needed these
Invoking
things to
them.
They're invoking, they're doing things with these rings, and they're doing things, forges or breaks social bonds. So it's like kind of a way into what people would now call Old Norse religion, but not through representative things of mythological stories, but which is the usual obsession of identifying Loki and identifying Odin, but understanding the lived and rituals of people, the embodied rituals of people, and the objects they deployed to make those rituals work. We don't know the details, but this is a kind of way into the very fabric of late Iron Age society. I mean,
I think so. And I think it's also a way, it's interesting when you talk about the stories and the myths too, because I think the problem with those, and I think I was watching one of your interviews, I think it was with Marion Moen, and you guys were also talking about this, that we sometimes in Viking Age archaeology, since it's a period where we do have some sources that are written, or that written sources that relate to the, and I'm one of those people. I'm kind of very like, I think that a lot of these do relate in some way. We can get something out of them, maybe not in a direct line all the time, but we have some sources that tell us some things. And I think the problem becomes that sometimes we think we know what's going on if we have the sources.
Yeah.
And I'm sure this is something you encounter way more doing Anglo-Saxon archaeology, because you actually have sources from the time period. And that, of course, we know as archaeologists, that's not the whole story.
No.
Or I think the problem sometimes when we bring in these other sources isn't that they can't tell us anything, but the problem is if we stop there. So for me, for example, thinking about, say, Thor and the idea of Thor and what Thor does in the myths and everything, to be like, oh, this ring has a symbol of Thor, so clearly this has something to do with Thor, and we know Thor is a god who does this and this and that. If you use that as kind of this is a sort of more mean way to put it than I actually am meaning it, but like a thought terminating cliche to be like, okay, that's the end of it. I think that's a problem, but I think what can be really interesting instead is if we take these things that we have sometimes used as that's the end of what we can say, or that's an answer, and actually use that as a question, that's when you really can get farther with things. So for example, for me, I was thinking about Thor, and it's like, okay, and I'm not the only one who's thought about this, but okay, so if this is about Thor, what does that mean then? If you have something associated with this god that, we think mythologically does this and this and that, then why would you want that in a burial? What does that mean? What does that say about what this is doing? So again, you can take something that could be sort of like, oh, that's all we can say, this is the answer, and use that as a way to start asking, I think, much more interesting or questions that tell us more about how people are actually doing things in the world.
I think that's really interesting, and this leads me to a sort of penultimate question, which is, where are the implications for the rest of the Viking world? Or the pre-Viking world, the late Iron Age world? The
late Iron Age world. Yeah.
How do we think about objects? These are special, ultimate, weird, strange, but common objects. They're doing something really important for people you could call a ritual spheres in crude terms. But what does that? Is there broader implications of your thesis and your work and your new insights for other kinds of objects, I wonder?
I think so. And I think for me, one of the main insights, I guess it's twofold, because I think there's, well, I guess that's a separate question. I think there's what the study of amulet rings can tell us about how the late Iron Age world works. And then I think there's things that the study of amulet rings can, I hope, help be an example for how we can think about kind of how we do archaeology on sort of weird ritual objects more generally. But I think the first one is, of course, I think one of the things that's important is actually, or that for me, looking at amulet rings and the details of how exactly they're being used. So I tried in my work in my dissertation to get really granular about the gestures, the actions, the what would it be like that, as you said, they're carrying them, they're moving them around. If a ring ends up on a pole, you have to forge it, and then you have to bring it up to the pole, and then somebody would see you hammering it on the pole. I didn't mention earlier, but there are some made of the smaller silver ones that seem to be things you can wear.
Yes.
When you're alive, whereas other ones are just things you kind of have after you're dead. But I think sometimes we talk about pre-Christian religions in this very generalized way. That, oh, there's, one sort of Old Norse religion, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And of course, at the same time, we know that isn't true, but it's very easy to fall back on that. And I think also, and it was funny because we were talking about the conversion earlier. I think sometimes there's also, since especially the Viking Age, there is this, very interesting, and it is very interesting process of conversion that I think sometimes we talk about pre-Christian religion and talk about how it changes and how it shifts and how the conversion happens, and don't always, I think, have a good idea of what's actually going on.
Yeah.
So part of what I wanted to do is to let myself be very specific and let myself think that it's important to know exactly what people are doing if we want to understand how it changes, and also just if we do want to understand this, as what would this have to do with sort of the worldview that they have, that knowing the details of the kind of, I think it's fascinating, but I can understand that some people might think, these sort of maybe sort of almost inconsequential details of a ritual, what that tells us about
it's that fine-grained information
the world
that gives the story. You can't understand how people make a pizza without knowing how the ingredients are acquired.
That's a great metaphor, and I'm going to steal that for one of my papers.
Feel free. I was just I'm always thinking of pizza, so it's just
but it's true. And I think so I think just the fact that studying amulet rings tells us about what Viking Age rituals actually included, because they are associated with so many other things. And some sites, you have this kind of feedback loop in East Scandinavian archaeology where we know the site is ritual because we found amulet rings there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And amulet rings are ritual, which has been kind of one of the things that's been hard about studying them, is that a lot of times you have things that are used in rituals that are used in other places, and then you can see how those become ritualized.
Yeah.
But amulet rings sort of just show up in ritual places. So what do you do with that? And so I think part of just, seeing what the practices are, and you can see, that where have they put these rings? How have they moved them around? How are they using space? How are they, what kind of actions are happening? What is relating to what in a material sense, which of course is the basis of archaeology. It is something you can do with these amulet ring depositions.
And that's exactly the story that archaeology can tell. And you tell it very well, not only with your text, but with your words. I said that last question was the penultimate one, but I think this one is because, of course, as well as, the front cover, your thesis deploys images by other people that try to show them in use, but you also, to give some examples, incorporate your own impressions of, of their use within these sites. I'd love you to tell us a little bit about your choices to show here people breaking them. You know, I mean, I'd love you to talk about these images, because I think they really add, they're part of your interpretation, aren't they?
Thank you. Yeah, so my choices with the images started from, I was discussing with my supervisors how hard it is to get a sense of action and motion
Yes,
when
yeah.
you're
The very things you're
doing,
talking about. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, when you're doing a 2D reconstruction.
Yeah.
And you know, that's just that's just the reality. And that I'm writing this thesis that I want very much to be about, you know, the real core question for me was, what were these rituals like for the people that were, the communities that were carrying them out, both in the sense of literally what they're like, and what does that tell us, which I suppose is a second part of the question we were just talking about that I didn't actually answer as yet. But what does this tell us about how they experience being in the world, how the world works for them? And so I'm talking about all this, you know, trying to think really hard about all the experiential aspects, trying to think really hard about, to let myself imagine, you know, what would be there. I mean, things we know that would be there. I mean, this is something that gets talked about a lot with, you know, burials. Of course, you know, we don't have all the organic material, but we know it would have been there.
Yeah.
You know, you talk very much about, you know, a cremation pyre and everything that would have been on it, and what that would have looked like, and how many impressions, you know, how many, you know, what sort of affect, you know, would have been experienced at that time. And so I was trying to think a lot about that. And so I'm talking about all these things, and I'm like, well, I want some way of giving some sense of this, the fact that these rituals would have been very, you know, colorful and very dramatic, and I wanted the reader to get some sense of them like being there. And so we talked about me and my supervisor talking about the fact it's hard to feel like, you know, a lot of times when you're looking at reconstructions of rituals, of course, you want to, you know, put kind of as much as you can have in there of like how people are standing and things. And it sometimes ends up looking like this kind of frozen tableau of a moment, because it is. And I think that, of course, there's really beautiful reconstructions of rituals like that do give us some parts of the impression. I mean, if you think of the ones where it's, you know, a grave laid out, that's not true. That is part of what people would have seen, and clearly is something that was important for the people making it, because they arranged it really carefully. But in this case, I wanted to emphasize something different, not just the kind of looking at the ritual, witnessing it, but I wanted to make some way of making the reader feel a little bit, imagining being in the ritual. And so I think it was Allison that said something about the idea of, you know, well, you could do something with, like, you know, their hands or what they're doing. And we were talking about that. And then I was at working with some of the field archaeologists that I had gotten to work with on the cult site I was writing about, Gruffet and Westmanland. And we were sorting through the amulet rings from the site back at the office, and looking at each one and noting down sort of how big it is and what condition it was in. And there's one amulet ring from the site, and you showed the drawing of it there, that it's been twisted open.
Yes.
Because of course that's one thing I think we have made kind of slight reference to now and then, but people are deliberately breaking rings at sites in ways that sometimes it seems like they may have been left to hang up and then kind of disintegrate, which is also interesting. But sometimes they're clearly very deliberately breaking them. in the same way that we see swords and other things being deliberately deformed. I mean, this is something that
there's a
people
lot
have
of
noticed.
breaking going on.
There's a lot of breaking.
Your Vendel Viking age, yeah.
And so this one ring, you can see some of them, they're broken and they're kind of just in pieces, but this one, you can, in a very kind of visceral way, see how they've twisted it. And I was talking to Anna Lagerstad, one of the archaeologists, about, how I want to do illustrations of some from each of the different sites about the rituals. And she said, well, you should have one of somebody breaking this ring.
Yeah, yeah.
And so that became the inspiration of that. I wanted to, in the ritual, in the drawings, none of them have anybody's faces in them or anything. It's the hands, and in several of the places, I've tried to give the sense that those could be your hands, or you're standing right next to the person, but I just sort of wanted to play with perspective to give this sense of immediacy, of being part of the ritual, and thinking about emphasizing that's the main theme of what I'm writing about, is kind of wanting to take amulet ring rituals, on their own terms. I love the pig too. I was very happy.
What are you doing over there? Give me some food, it's saying.
Exactly. So I wanted to make it, feel alive in that way.
The animals. Love it.
So that became part of my process of thinking about this, is how can we represent ritual in a way that gestures towards that this is all the things that we say we want to talk about when we talk about ritual: experience and motion. And I just wanted the reader to feel like they're there, and it became part of the process, of course, because making that, I very much was thinking about, well, what would have been there? What would it look like if you're standing like this? And I think the one that I use on the cover of the thesis, which is probably the most sort of archetypical amulet ring ritual, which is putting a Thor's hammer type ring in a cremation barrel, which is, I think, the most famous sort of way of using amulet rings. And thinking about the action of that what it would look like if you're standing there and you're putting this ring in the circular ring, in this circular urn, in this case, the grave that picture is based off of. You have a round curb around the inner part of the grave, and what that would have looked like when you're standing there, these sort of series of circles, that made me start thinking about, what would that mean? What would this sort of experience have meant to that person, that you see these kind of enclosures, and that when you're doing that, that's what you're seeing in that moment, that kind of what that would mean for you.
Absolutely. And I think it really helps the thesis tell its story. So this is a really fascinating piece of work, Meghan, and congratulations for it. My final question is, what's next for you? Or is there any final points you would like to share, or anything we've missed out that you feel, this is your chance to sort of add anything else, or to suggest what might be you doing next?
Oh my goodness. I think I feel like in some ways I've just not made any sense at all, because they're such they are objects that connect to so many things. It's almost hard to keep a through line on them.
No, it's been very clear.
I guess I want to go back just a moment to the question of why do we sort of care about what people do with amulet rings? Besides that, I think they're fascinating and I'm obsessed with them. But I think and this is something we've referred to throughout the discussion today, but I think looking closely at how they're used tells us about what the communities that use them thought about what rituals did for them and to the world around them.
Yes.
And how the world works. There's been a lot of discussion about, what is a late Iron Age ontology, way of being in the world, a way of thinking about the world. And there's been a push to start thinking about, is this something more animist? And of course, that can be taken to mean something quite, I think sometimes people hear that word and they think of something quite idealized and harmonious, and especially something that they kind of put in opposition to, say, later Christian ways of looking at the world. And I think that on the one hand, this is something, I think this is true, that the world of the Viking Age is more animist, is just one part of this larger umbrella of the world is, as I said, relational. It's a community. There's all kinds of things in the community, the more than human community. I really like that phrase. And I agree with the push to start thinking about the fact that, Iron Age people are experiencing the world not just with these fixed pantheons that we know about from literature, but these other groups of spirits and ancestors, and the way the natural world is home to different beings. And of course, for me, it's also the remembering that what does that actually entail? For one thing, that I have a colleague who's working with currently practicing like animist communities in Siberia, and Eric Solfeld. And he says, of course, people will talk about animism. Oh, it's this beautiful thing. You're in community with the world. But again, going back to, if you're in community with things, he says, being an animist in Siberia, it can be a nightmare, because you have to deal with these spirits and things that are dangerous. In a community, think about in a society, in your family, you have obligations to people that you might not want to have. So that's a really good point. And I think it's just to, for one thing, think about the fact that this isn't something that you can oversimplify. There's not just one relational ontology. There's not just one kind of animism or whatever you want to call it. But and that it's not all harmony and rainbows. It's both, that you have, and this isn't to say that people in relational worlds can't have very, I'm sure there are, you can have very close and very meaningful and very parts of relating to the world that make you feel safe. But a community, there's conflicts and problems as well as helpful relations. And to me, looking at amulet rings and the way that they're using them tells us something about the fact that the people your experience of this world, as your world is constantly full of these potential for tapping into power.
Absolutely.
In the natural world, and in your relationship with supernatural beings. But it's also full of it's also dangerous, and amulet rings can get used in moments that are dangerous but also powerful. And they're a way, I think, to make places and times that could be dangerous for you in the community into something that's instead useful for the community. And there's other scholars that have also observed that, this Viking Age interest in, shape-shifting the world. It's, the Viking world is more queer than people want to think about, and things. And that, so this ability to, I know you've written about this too, and also the Anglo-Saxon world, the ability to bind or control the way that the world can change and shift around is really powerful.
That's really interesting.
If we want to go back to Thor, Thor is a very kind of stabilizing force in a lot of myths. So the Viking Age world is full of, or the late Iron Age world is full of both power and danger. And also you can use amulet rings to, you're not just responding to this world, you're not just caught up into it, but you can also affect it. You can also make a place sacred by using amulet rings in it. You can make a place powerful. You can bound off a place and say, this is sacred. And that also has very real effects in the world, both for how you would experience that, oh, now this this maybe is protected in a different way, but also say legally, there's
Yes.
things written about how, within a V band, the boundaries of site, that different rules apply,
Yeah,
or,
absolutely.
A contract with another person that literally changes how the world works. So
Well, thank
for
you so
me,
much, Megan. It's been really exciting to see this range of new work and how you are grappling with these objects that take us from, as you say, legal, religious, social realms in so many different ways. And I think it's your thesis is available for download, and
thanks.
everyone can go and read it, and we'll put a links in the bio to all your socials so people can find you and learn more about your exciting research. And I look forward to what comes next.
Don't be afraid to get weird is my thing for other archaeologists, because the strange, weird things we find, that's where we have to really start thinking, like, that's when we have to take, the people we're studying on their terms, not ours. And I think that's good and fun and fascinating.
Thank you so much.
If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to Howard Williams on YouTube. In addition, consider following the Archaeodeath WordPress blog at howardwilliamsblog.wordpress.com.